I worked as a security guard for a property management company in Ohio, covering various sites depending on who called out or which buildings needed coverage. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent for overnight work, and I didn't mind being alone. I always figured that quiet nights were the best kind. You just clock in, walk your rounds, and try not to fall asleep in your patrol car. But there's one post that still makes my stomach twist whenever I think about it. It was in 2019 at an old commercial complex just outside of Dayton. The property had been half abandoned for years, and what remained were three tenants: a small manufacturing company, a storage facility, and an accounting office. The rest of the six-story complex was vacant, dark, and locked down. When I took the post, the site supervisor told me it was an easy gig. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I'd have to unlock the main gate for employees from the manufacturing company who came in around 4 a.m., check the perimeter every hour, and make sure nobody broke into the empty parts of the building. There had been some copper thefts and trespassers in the past, but he said it was probably just bored kids. He didn't mention the real reason they couldn't keep anyone there for long. The first few nights went smoothly. The place was creepy. Sure, it was a maze of silent hallways, peeling paint, flickering exit signs, and that constant buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. But I'd worked worse. The building was massive, shaped like an H, with long hallways connecting the two main wings. The storage wing was empty, except for some leftover furniture and boxes from companies that had moved out. The manufacturing area still had power and some lights, but the far end was sealed off with caution tape where renovations had stopped years ago. I always carried a flashlight, a radio, and my personal phone. The property had security cameras, but only a few actually worked. The monitors were in the front lobby's small office, and most feeds were frozen on black screens or static. I remember thinking how pointless it felt to sit there watching dead monitors, so I did my rounds religiously to make up for it. Around the fourth night, things started to feel off. It began with little things: doors that were unlocked when I knew I'd pick him, lights that flickered in rooms with no power, and the sound of footsteps echoing from upper floors that were supposed to be sealed. I chalked it up to the building settling, maybe wind pushing through broken vents. Old buildings make strange noises, and when you're alone at night, your mind amplifies them. Then came the incident with the elevator. There were 3 elevators in the complex, but only one near the center of the building still worked. I rarely used it because it groaned loudly between floors, and I preferred taking the stairs. One night around 2 a.m., as I was finishing my round on the first floor, I heard the elevator bell ding from down the hall. It startled me because I hadn't called it, and no one else was supposed to be in the building. I walked toward it, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The doors opened slowly, revealing an empty car. I stepped closer and shined the light inside. The floor indicator above the door showed 5. I knew that couldn't be right. The 5th floor was sealed off completely, and the power was cut up there. Yet the elevator had just come from it. I stood there for a few seconds, my pulse heavy in my chest, waiting for the doors to close again. When they finally did, the elevator immediately started moving, upward. I watched the lights on the panel flicker. 2, 3, 4, 5. Then it stopped. The hum of the machinery went silent. I tried calling my supervisor, but there was no signal inside the building. I told myself I'd check the 5th floor landing just to make sure no one had broken in. The stairwell was pitch dark, the air colder than the rest of the building. When I reached the 5th floor, I saw the old barricade, 2 plywood boards nailed across the entrance, and a "Do Not Enter" sign covered in dust. But one of the boards had been pried loose. I felt an ache in my gut. I didn't want to go in there, but I couldn't ignore it either. I shined my light through the gap. The beam fell on a long hallway with cracked tiles and hanging wires. The far end disappeared into darkness. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no movement. But the silence felt thick, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I called out, "Security! Anyone up here?" No answer. I pushed the board aside enough to slip through. My boots echoed softly against the tile as I walked down the corridor. Every door I passed had a small glass window, but most were covered with grime or old papers. The smell was strange, like burnt dust and something metallic. Halfway down the hall, my flashlight flickered, then died. That was when I heard it. A faint humming sound, like electricity or a distant voice. It wasn't coming from the elevator or the stairwell. It was ahead of me, deeper in the floor. I tapped my flashlight and it blinked back to life for a split second. I saw a figure standing at the very end of the hall. It was facing the wall, tall and motionless. I couldn't make out details, but it looked like someone wearing a long coat or uniform. My throat went dry. "Sir, this area is closed," I said, forcing my voice to sound steady. No response. I took one step forward and the figure moved. It turned slightly, just enough for me to see the side of its head. There was something wrong with it. The outline was wrong, like its neck was too long or its shoulders too narrow. Before I could say anything else, my flashlight went out completely. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the stairwell, slamming the door shut and catching my breath. I waited there for a good 5 minutes, listening, but heard nothing. When I finally went back to the security office, I noticed the elevator indicator was back at 1. The next morning, I reported the incident to my supervisor. He didn't even look surprised. He just sighed and said, "Yeah, we've had a few guards mention stuff like that. Probably squatters or shadows playing tricks." I knew what I'd seen wasn't just shadows, but I didn't argue. I needed the job, and it wasn't the first time management brushed off strange stuff. For the next week, I avoided the 5th floor entirely. The elevator never acted up again, but the nights grew heavier somehow. I'd hear faint whispers through the radio, static that formed words I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes I'd swear I heard my own name whispered from the far end of the hallways. One night, I met one of the manufacturing employees, a guy named Ray. He was in his 50s, quiet but friendly. He told me he'd been with the company for over 20 years and remembered when the whole complex was bustling. I asked him about the sealed floors, and he got this uneasy look. "You don't want to go up there," he said quietly. Back in 2004, there was a fire on the 5th. Started in one of the old labs. They said it was electrical, but the crew working up there swore they saw someone before it started. A man in a long coat walking through the hallways at night. 3 people died before the sprinklers kicked in. I didn't know what to say. The pieces started clicking together. The elevator from the 5th floor, the figure I saw, the smell of burnt metal. The following night was when everything went completely wrong. A storm rolled in around midnight. The building creaked and moaned under the wind. Rain hammered against the windows, and thunder made the lights flicker. Around 2:30 a.m., I was sitting in the front office drinking coffee when the power cut out completely. The emergency lights came on a few seconds later, casting everything in a red glow. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, but the radio was filled with static. That was normal during storms, so I didn't think much of it. I did my usual perimeter check, moving through the lobby, past the empty offices, and into the West Wing. That's when I saw it again, the elevator indicator light. It glowed faintly above the doors, showing 5. The power was out, yet the elevator was moving. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. The red emergency lights flickered as the elevator descended. I backed away slowly, shining my flashlight at the doors. When they opened, the air that came out was ice cold. The elevator was empty. I told myself I was done ignoring this. I called out again, "If someone's here, identify yourself." Nothing. I started toward the stairwell to check the 5th floor again. Maybe I was being stupid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wanted me to go up there. The climb felt endless. My flashlight dimmed with every step, and the air grew colder. When I reached the 5th floor door, I noticed the "Do Not Enter" sign was gone. The plywood boards were lying on the floor, split down the middle. I hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. The hallway looked different this time. There was no dust, no broken tiles. Everything looked new. The lights were on, bright white, humming softly. I could smell cleaning supplies and fresh paint. It was like I'd stepped back in time before the fire. I took a few steps forward. I heard voices down the hall, laughter, distant and muffled. I followed the sound to one of the rooms, peering through the glass window. Inside were 3 people in lab coats, sitting at a table. One of them turned and looked right at me. It was a man, maybe mid-40s, with slicked back hair and sharp eyes. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't friendly. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the image blinked away. The room was empty again, dark and decayed. My flashlight flickered, and I realized I could hear something else now, a soft crackling sound, like fire. I turned and saw smoke curling at the far end of the hallway. Panic set in. I ran toward the stairwell, but the smoke thickened fast, choking the air. The lights overhead burst one by one, plunging me into near darkness. Somewhere behind me, footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate. I didn't look back. I reached the stairwell door, yanked it open, and stumbled through. I ran down the steps, coughing, until I reached the first floor. When I pushed through the final door, the lights came back on and the smoke was gone. Everything looked normal again. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. When morning came, I told my supervisor I was done. He barely blinked, just marked it down as a resignation. That was fine by me. I never went back to that site. 2 months later, I ran into Ray again at a diner. He asked me why I'd quit so suddenly, so I told him what happened. He went pale halfway through my story. "Did you see the man?" he asked. I nodded. He leaned closer and said, "The guy who started that fire, they said he was one of the contractors. He wore a long coat. After the fire, they never found his body. Some people think he didn't die in there. Others think he never left." I didn't know how to respond. I just stared at my coffee, replaying that night over and over. Even now, years later, I can't walk into any dark hallway without thinking about that building. I'll be half asleep and hear an elevator bell in my dreams, that soft ding right before the doors open. Sometimes I wake up to the faint smell of burnt metal. I tell myself it's all in my head, just leftover fear from one bad night on the job. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows stretch long, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. A tall figure, standing still, watching. And I remember that cold rush of air from the elevator, and the way that man smiled through the glass window as the world burned around him. That's when I know I didn't just imagine it. Something followed me out of that building, something that shouldn't have. I never worked security again after that. I couldn't. The night feels too alive now, too aware. Every creak of a door or hum of a light feels like it's waiting for me to let my guard down. I moved to another town, got a different job, tried to start over. But every once in a while, I'll drive past an old office complex or a vacant warehouse and see a single elevator light glowing in the dark. It's always showing the number 5, and I keep driving. Story the end. I've worked as a security guard for over 15 years, mostly night shifts. I've seen my share of strange things. Drunks stumbling through parking lots, people trying to sneak into warehouses for a thrill, and the occasional wild animal triggering the motion sensors. But what happened at the Martin Industrial Complex in 2017 was something I still can't explain. And it's the reason I've never worked a solo night shift again. The complex was located on the outskirts of Toledo, Ohio. It was a sprawling lot of old warehouses that used to belong to a manufacturing company, but after they shut down, parts of the property were leased out to smaller businesses. My company got the contract to patrol it after there were reports of copper theft and vandalism. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent and I liked the quiet. On my first night there, the site supervisor, an older guy named Ron, gave me a tour of the property. There were 5 buildings, A through E, and only 2 of them were still in use. The others were abandoned, their windows boarded up and lights disconnected. Building D, in particular, was considered unsafe because part of the roof had caved in years earlier. Ron told me, "If you hear anything from D, just log it and call it in. Don't go inside. Company policy." He handed me a set of keys and a walkie-talkie, told me I'd be alone for the week because the second guard had called in sick. And that was that. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd do my rounds every hour, check the doors and gates, and spend the rest of the time sitting in the security shack watching the CCTV feeds. Most of the cameras were positioned on the main paths between buildings. A few of the older warehouses didn't have coverage inside because the wiring had deteriorated years ago. On the 4th night, just after midnight, I saw something odd on one of the cameras, a flicker of movement near Building D. It was fast, just a dark blur passing under the broken light. I figured it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or stray dog. I logged it, grabbed my flashlight, and walked the perimeter. As I got closer to Building D, I noticed the air felt different, stale, heavier somehow. The flashlight beam picked up dust swirling in the air like mist. When I reached the side where I'd seen the movement, there was nothing there. But the side door, the one that was supposed to be padlocked shut, was slightly open. I radioed it into Ron, but there was no response. The static on the line was louder than usual. I tried again, same result. I was about to head back when I heard something from inside the building. Soft, rhythmic thuds. It wasn't machinery, it sounded like footsteps. "Hello," I called out. "This is security. You're trespassing." The sound stopped immediately. Then, after a few seconds, I heard what I swear was a faint exhale, like someone trying to stay quiet. My stomach tightened. Every bit of training told me not to go in, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open just enough to shine the flashlight inside. The beam cut through the dust, illuminating rusted beams, cracked concrete, and piles of debris. And then it landed on a shadow at the far end of the corridor, tall, motionless. I froze. "Hey, who's there?" No answer. I stepped forward just one step and the beam flickered. When the light steadied again, the shadow was gone. I backed out immediately, shut the door, and this time I chained it myself. When I got back to the shack, I checked the camera again. Nothing. The door was shut. The next morning, I told Ron about it. He frowned, but he didn't look surprised. "Building D's always been weird," he said. "Old night guys used to hear stuff too. Just stay out of there." I wanted to leave it at that, but over the next few nights, things got worse. Around 2 a.m. one night, the cameras in the north lot started glitching. Static, distortion, then brief flashes of what looked like a figure walking toward Building D. It would appear for half a second, then vanish. Every time it did, the lights in the shack flickered. I thought it might be a system issue, so I called the maintenance number. The tech on the other end said he could see my feed remotely and that there was no one on camera, only interference. I asked him what could cause it. He said, "Old wiring, maybe moisture," then hesitated and added, "or sometimes heat signatures." That last part stuck with me. The warehouse hadn't had power in years. There shouldn't have been any heat signatures. The following night, I parked the patrol car right near Building D. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. I sat there for maybe half an hour, windows rolled down, the night air cold and quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a single loud bang from inside the building, like a door slamming shut. I jumped out, shined the light again, and yelled, "This is security!" No answer. But as I stood there, I noticed something. Faint music, distant, like an old radio playing somewhere deep inside the building. It was warped, barely recognizable, but I could make out the melody. It sounded like a 1940s swing tune. That didn't make any sense. There was no electricity, no equipment. I backed away, but before I could get to the car, I heard what sounded like someone whispering my name. It wasn't loud, more like it was carried by the wind. But I heard it. I didn't stick around after that. I drove back to the shack and didn't move until daylight. Over the next few shifts, I tried to ignore it. I stayed near the cameras, kept the radio on for background noise, but the interference kept getting worse. Flickering feeds, shapes darting across the screens, and one night, the system froze on a single frame showing the inside of Building D. There shouldn't have been any cameras inside, but there it was, an image of a long hallway lit by a single hanging bulb. And at the far end, something was standing there. It looked human, but the proportions were wrong. The legs were too long, the arms hung too low. Then the screen went black. I called Ron again. He told me he'd come by the next night. When he arrived, I showed him the footage, but the recording had somehow erased itself. He looked uneasy and said, "I'll have maintenance disconnect the feeds from that section. You just stay out of there tonight." That night, around 3 a.m., all the power went out. Total darkness. The backup generator should have kicked in, but it didn't. I stepped outside using my flashlight to navigate when I saw movement near the loading dock of Building D. A figure was standing there, perfectly still, facing me. I shouted, "Hey, hey," and started walking toward it. It turned and walked inside. Against every instinct, I followed. I could hear my boots crunching on broken glass, my own breathing loud in the silence. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hand. Halfway down the corridor, I saw something spray-painted on the wall. "Help us." I stopped, trying to steady my breath. Then the sound came again, the music. Same old tune, faint but clear, echoing from deeper inside. As I followed it, I started seeing more graffiti, names, dates. The latest one read 1993. That was the year the factory shut down. The hallway opened into a large room. The roof had partially collapsed, moonlight pouring in through the gaps. The radio music grew louder, but there was no radio, just an old speaker hanging from a beam, wires dangling. Then, from behind a pile of debris, I heard footsteps. I swung the flashlight around and froze. A man stood there, wearing what looked like an old factory uniform, the fabric torn and covered in soot. His face was pale, eyes wide open, mouth moving silently. "Sir?" I said. He lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the corner. When I turned, my light fell on something else. 5 more figures, all dressed the same way, standing motionless, facing the wall. And then the light went out. I heard whispering, soft, fast, overlapping voices all around me. I backed up, fumbling for the exit, when a cold hand brushed my shoulder. I swung the flashlight wildly, but when it came back on, the room was empty. The music stopped. I bolted out of there and didn't stop running until I reached the shack. When Ron came the next morning, he found me sitting outside, shaking. I told him everything. He didn't say a word, just looked toward Building D and muttered, "They never found them." "What?" I asked. He told me that back in 93, 5 workers died when the roof collapsed. Their bodies were never recovered. The company went bankrupt soon after, and the site was shut down. I quit that night. Didn't even bother collecting my last check. A month later, I got a call from another guard who took the job after me. He said he'd started hearing music at night too. That was the last time I spoke to him. A few weeks later, Ron told me the guy didn't show up for his shift. They found his patrol car still running near Building D. The door was open, keys in the ignition. They never found him either. To this day, I can still hear that faint 1940s song in my head whenever I think about that place. And I'll never work another night shift alone again. Story the end. I took a job as a night security guard at the old Halverson cold storage facility in Kansas City back in 2020. I had just gotten laid off from a warehouse job and needed something steady, anything that would cover rent. The ad said, quiet work environment, light patrol, overnight shifts. It sounded perfect. No customers, no coworkers, no bosses breathing down my neck. Just me, a radio, and the dark. The facility was huge, 4 connected warehouses filled with rows of refrigerated units and freezers. During the day, trucks came and went nonstop, loading and unloading meat, produce, and whatever else the distributors handled. But at night, everything shut down. My job was to make rounds, check the temperature logs, make sure no one was trespassing, and keep an eye on the surveillance feeds from the control office. The first thing that struck me on my first night was the cold. It wasn't just the temperature, it was how it felt inside. It was a deep, biting cold that seemed to stick to your skin, even in the office where the heaters worked fine. My supervisor, Ron, an old-timer with 20 years in security, handed me a ring of keys and said, "If you hear anything strange, don't go looking for it alone. Radio me first. Some parts of this place carry sound funny. You'll swear someone's walking right behind you when it's just the compressors running." He said it like he was half joking, half serious. I laughed it off and got to work. The first few nights went smooth. I made my rounds, checked the units, wrote up the logs. The worst thing I dealt with was the noise, the constant low hum of the freezers, and the occasional metallic clank when the pipes expanded. The sound carried through the long concrete corridors in weird ways. Sometimes I'd swear someone was moving on the other side of the wall, even when I knew the place was empty. Then came my 6th night. It was a Sunday, quiet as usual. Around 2:30 a.m., I was sitting in the office drinking coffee when I heard something over the intercom system. A faint sound, like static at first, then what I could have sworn was a voice. It was muffled, distant, like someone speaking from inside a tunnel. I turned down the heater and listened. The voice was repeating something over and over. I leaned closer to the speaker and realized it was saying, "Help me." I grabbed my flashlight and radio. "Ron, you hearing that?" I asked. There was a crackle. Then Ron's voice came through, calm as ever. "Could be interference. Check freezer unit 3. The intercom's wired through that zone." Unit 3 was the largest freezer in the facility, a long, narrow corridor lined with metal racks stacked with crates of frozen goods. The air inside was so cold it burned your lungs. I stepped in and the door shut behind me with that heavy refrigerator seal thud. My breath came out in thick clouds. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed off the metal walls. Nothing. I walked down the narrow aisle, my boots crunching on frost. The hum of the compressors grew louder the deeper I went. About halfway through, I heard it again. Soft, right behind me. "Help me." I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the fog of my own breath. The aisle was empty. My heart started pounding. "Ron," I said into the radio, "there's something weird in here." I heard it again. "Copy that. You're alone in the building. I just checked the entrance logs. Might be feedback from the intercom wiring," he said. But I knew that wasn't feedback. It was too clear, too human. I hurried back to the door. When I reached it, it wouldn't budge. I pulled on the handle hard, but it was sealed tight. My radio crackled, but all I heard was faint static. Then a whisper through the static, "Don't leave me." That's when I started to panic. I pounded on the door. "Ron, the door's stuck." No response. The temperature gauge above the racks read -15 degrees Fahrenheit. My hands were starting to go numb even through the gloves. I kicked the door again, and it finally gave way, slamming open with a gust of cold air. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping. When I got back to the office, Ron was standing there. "You okay?" he asked. I told him what happened. He didn't look surprised, just sighed. "You probably got locked in when the seal froze. Happens sometimes. As for the voice, maybe you're just tired. This place gets in your head." But I wasn't tired. I knew what I'd heard. And the next night proved it. Around the same time, 2:30 a.m., the intercom crackled again. This time it wasn't "help me," it was humming, a slow, tuneless hum like someone softly singing to themselves. I traced the sound to Freezer Unit 5. When I opened the door, the hum stopped. I swept my flashlight across the racks, and for just a second, I saw something. A handprint. Frozen, smeared into the frost on the inside of the glass panel. I froze. It looked fresh. The shape was small, like a woman's hand. When I got closer, I noticed streaks leading downward, like someone had dragged their fingers through the ice. I called Ron again. He didn't answer. I checked his station, empty. His coffee mug was still warm, his radio on the desk. I searched for him for nearly an hour, walking every corridor, calling his name. Nothing. At 4:12 a.m., he came over the radio, whispering, "Unit 3. That's all he said. I sprinted there. The door was open, frost spilling out onto the concrete. Inside, my flashlight beam caught something red against the white frost. Blood. A smear leading down the aisle. I followed it slowly, heart racing, until I reached the far end. Lying on the floor was Ron's flashlight, still on, its beam pointing at the corner where the racks met the wall. The blood trail ended there. But there was no Ron. The only thing on the wall was another handprint, larger this time, and still wet. I ran out of there and called the police. They searched the whole place for hours. No sign of Ron. His car was still in the lot, his jacket hanging on the back of his chair. The cops took my statement, probably thinking I was hallucinating. The company shut down operations for a few days while they investigated. When I went back to collect my things, one of the warehouse managers pulled me aside. He looked uneasy. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, "but that place, it's had problems for years. Back in the early 2000s, a refrigeration tech got trapped in one of the freezers overnight. The latch malfunctioned. They didn't find her until the next morning." "Jesus," I said. "What happened to her?" "She froze solid," he said quietly. "And they say the compressors in that unit never worked right again. Kept shutting off around the same time every night. I quit that day." A few months later, I was working security at a hospital across town. One night I was doing rounds past the kitchen area and I heard it again, that same faint hum coming from the walk-in freezer, the same pitch, the same slow rhythm. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the heavy metal door, feeling the cold air seeping from the edges. I didn't open it. I turned around and walked the other way. Still, every once in a while I wake up in the middle of the night and swear I can hear that humming again. Soft, distant, coming from somewhere deep and cold. Story, the end. I took a job as a night security guard at a furniture warehouse on the outskirts of Joliet, Illinois, in late 2019. The company was called Midstate Storage and Supply, a massive concrete complex built sometime in the 70s. I got the job through a friend from church who said the place was always looking for dependable night workers. I needed the money, and the ad said quiet, minimal contact, simple rounds. That sounded fine to me. My shift started at 7 p.m. and ran until 7 a.m. The warehouse was enormous, over 250,000 square feet, divided into sections labeled A through F. Section A was the loading dock, B through D were furniture storage, E was the packaging area, and F was the old manufacturing wing that had been shut down years ago. I was told to patrol every section once per hour, check all the padlocks, record any movement on the cameras, and radio in anything strange. For the first few weeks, it really was uneventful. I listened to music in the shack, sipped coffee, and took my walks through the empty halls every hour. The hum of the overhead lights and the sound of my boots on the concrete were my constant companions. The air always smelled faintly like varnish and dust, a mix that clung to my uniform by morning. It was the third week on the job that things began to feel off. It started with the motion sensors in Section F. They were old but reliable, and one night around 3 a.m., the alert light on the panel in the shack blinked red. Motion detected, Zone F. That was strange because that wing had been closed for years. There were no deliveries there, no staff, and I was told the electricity to that area was mostly shut off. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and keyring and walked the long corridor toward Section F. The overhead bulbs flickered more the farther I went, and the air grew colder. When I reached the metal door marked F, I found it slightly open. That door was supposed to stay locked at all times. I pushed it open slowly, shining my light inside. The beam cut through a fog of dust. Old machinery sat scattered around, covered with sheets. There was a faint dripping sound somewhere deep in the dark. I called out, "Security! Anyone here?" My voice echoed for a long time, then died out. I waited, heard nothing, and decided to walk the length of the room. The flashlight beam shook a little as I moved. About halfway through, I noticed boot prints in the dust, fresh, leading deeper inside. They weren't mine. I followed them cautiously until they ended near an old assembly table. I crouched down, touched the prints. They were damp. That didn't make sense. There hadn't been rain in days, and there were no leaks. Then I noticed something else, an oily metallic smell hanging in the air, like old blood. The motion detector light blinked again on the wall panel nearby. My radio crackled with static. I raised it to my mouth to call dispatch, but a faint voice whispered through the static before I could speak. "Don't look behind you." I froze. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I didn't turn around for a full 5 seconds. When I finally did, there was no one there, but the heavy metal door that I'd left open was now swinging slowly shut. I ran. I spent the rest of the night in the shack with the door locked, eyes on the camera monitors. The feed for Section F showed nothing but grainy darkness. I filed a report about the open door and the motion alert, but I didn't mention the voice. I didn't want to sound crazy. 2 nights later, the same thing happened. Motion detected in Section F, around 2:40 a.m. Only this time, when I checked the cameras, I saw something, just for a second. A figure moving between the rows of old equipment. It was tall, unsteady, almost gliding. The image flickered and cut to static before I could zoom in. When I went to check the door to Section F again, it was locked tight. I hesitated before touching it, unsure if I wanted to see what was inside. My flashlight barely worked anymore, flickering like it was running out of batteries, even though I'd replaced them earlier that evening. I heard something move inside, slow, scraping footsteps, as if someone was dragging their feet along the concrete. Then, suddenly, the sound of metal clattering across the floor. That was enough. I backed away, locked the door again, and called my supervisor. She said no one should be in that section and told me to avoid going inside. Maintenance would inspect it in the morning. The next day, when I came in for my shift, my supervisor, Diane, looked pale. She said the maintenance guys checked Section F and found nothing, but there were fresh footprints in the dust, like someone barefoot had been walking in circles around the old machines. I should have quit then. 2 nights after that, I was sitting in the shack, fighting off sleep, when the radios went haywire. First static, then faint voices, not from any of our channels. One of them was whispering my name. Mark. It was quiet, drawn out, like someone testing the word. I froze, holding the radio. Who is this? Static again, then a faint laugh. That night, I didn't do patrols. I stayed inside and watched the cameras. At 3:12 a.m., the feed for Section F flickered back to life, showing a blurry figure standing motionless in the middle of the floor. It was hunched over slightly as though it was staring at something on the ground. I leaned closer. The figure straightened suddenly and turned toward the camera. Its face, or where its face should have been, was featureless, just pale skin and dark sockets where eyes should be. The feed cut to static again. I didn't go to Section F anymore. But the activity started spreading to the rest of the warehouse. Doors that were locked would be wide open on my next patrol. Stacks of chairs would be moved to the opposite side of the room between rounds. One night, I found the word stay scrawled across the inside of a supply closet door in what looked like grease or tar. Diane didn't believe me until she came in for a surprise inspection one night. I was sitting in the shack when she knocked on the door at 1:15 a.m., clipboard in hand. We talked for a few minutes about the reports, and I showed her the camera for Section F, static. I told her the feed would occasionally flicker back to life. Right then, it did. We both watched as the screen lit up, showing the empty room. Then, slowly, something moved across the frame, tall, thin, shadowed. It walked behind a row of machines and disappeared. Diane went white. She asked if anyone else had access. I told her no. She said she'd come back in the morning with the police to check, but she never got that chance. At around 3 a.m., while I was on patrol near Section D, I heard a distant scream echo through the concrete hallways. It came from the direction of Section F. I ran back to the shack to grab my keys and flashlight, and when I looked at the monitors, the feed for Section F was flickering again. The figure was there, closer to the camera now, standing almost right beneath it, looking up. The scream came again, louder, then cut off abruptly. I ran toward Section F, heart pounding. The door was wide open. Inside, everything was pitch black, except for the faint glow of the emergency exit light. I called out for Diane, but there was no answer. I walked in slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand. The smell hit me first, metallic, like rust and old oil. Near the back of the room, I found Diane's clipboard lying on the ground. No sign of her. The concrete was smeared with something dark. I took a step back, and my boot slipped slightly. I looked down. There was a bare footprint in the dust right next to mine. It wasn't mine. It was larger. The radio on my shoulder crackled suddenly, making me jump. A voice, distorted, came through. "We told you not to come back." I dropped the radio and ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside in the parking lot. I called 911 from my cell phone, breathless, saying something had happened to my supervisor inside the building. When the police arrived, they searched the entire warehouse. They didn't find her. They said the door to Section F was locked when they got there, and there were no signs of forced entry. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but none of them believed me. The company suspended me for interfering with an ongoing investigation, and eventually let me go. A few weeks later, I drove by the warehouse. It was abandoned, fenced off, the lights gone. The company had sold it off after the incident. About a month later, I got a call from one of the maintenance guys who used to work there. He said the new owners had tried to renovate Section F, but stopped after 2 workers quit. They said they kept hearing footsteps behind them, even when they were alone, and found tools scattered across the floor in strange patterns. One of them claimed he saw someone standing in the dark corner of the room. When he shined his flashlight, there was no one there, but in the dust, he found 2 sets of bare footprints. I don't work nights anymore. I can't stand silence or flickering lights. Sometimes when I wake up around 3 a.m., I still hear faint static from the old radio I kept as a souvenir, even though it's not plugged in. And every once in a while, I swear I hear a voice whisper my name through the static. Story, the end. I worked as a night security guard at an old manufacturing plant in Detroit, Michigan, back in the winter of 2020. The place had been partially abandoned for years. 2 main factory buildings, a few small office blocks, and a huge yard filled with rusting equipment. During the day, a handful of small businesses rented spaces, mostly warehouses and storage units. But at night, it was just me and the echoing machinery. My shifts ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I had a small security office in the main building, equipped with a bank of old CCTV monitors, a desk, and a coffee machine that barely worked. My duties were simple: patrol the property, check doors and windows, and respond to any alarms. Most nights were quiet, and I enjoyed the solitude. The first odd thing happened during my third week. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing a routine patrol of Factory Building 2. As I approached the back entrance, I noticed the heavy steel door to one of the storage bays was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it on my previous round. When I pushed it the rest of the way open, I noticed something unusual. A series of bare footprints in the dust, leading from the doorway toward the center of the warehouse. The prints ended abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. I radioed the incident to dispatch, but the line was filled with static. I closed the door, fastened the latch, and went back to the office. When I reviewed the security footage later, the door had never been opened. There was no one on camera, and yet the prints were there as clear as day. After that night, strange things started happening regularly. Doors I had locked would be opened during the next patrol. Motion sensors in empty corridors would trigger alarms. Sometimes I heard footsteps echoing behind me, even though I knew I was alone. Occasionally, a soft whisper would drift through the air vents, too faint to understand, but definitely human. One night, around 3:15 a.m., I was in the office when the intercom crackled to life. Through the static came a whisper, "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding. The voice didn't come from the intercom. It felt like it was right behind me. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward Factory 2. The overhead lights flickered, and the air felt icy, even though the night wasn't particularly cold. Inside, the warehouse was empty, but the smell was overpowering. Sweet, metallic, and sour, like rotting iron. My flashlight beam caught the faint outline of footprints again, leading toward the far corner. There was nothing else, no movement, no sound, except the soft echo of my own breathing. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences intensified. The cameras would flicker and show shadows moving where no one was. Doors would slam on their own. I saw a figure standing in the corner of Factory 2, barefoot, wearing a worn-out jumpsuit, his face gray and waxy, one eye reflecting the flashlight. I tried calling out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure would vanish whenever I moved closer. I started recording audio during my patrols. Listening back the next day was terrifying. Footsteps pacing in circles, dragging sounds across the concrete floor, and a low, broken whisper, "Still working." I later found out that a maintenance worker had died in Factory 2 decades earlier. He had been crushed between a forklift and a stack of pallets during a night shift. Rumor among the old employees was that his spirit never left, and I realized I was encountering him. The final night I worked there, the events escalated to their worst. Around 2:50 a.m., every alarm in Factory 2 went off at once. On the monitors, lights flickered throughout the building, elevators moved between floors, and I saw the figure again, standing perfectly still in the main hallway. Then all the cameras went dark, and the intercom came alive with the voice, "Don't leave, don't leave." I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the office, heart pounding. The door was locked, but the figure was already there, just beyond the window, staring at me. I don't remember how I got to my car. I drove off in the freezing winter air, not stopping until I was miles away. Weeks later, Factory 2 was condemned and scheduled for demolition. They left everything inside. I like to think that the maintenance worker, whatever remained of him, was still trapped there, reliving that moment of death every night. Even now, years later, if I'm alone at night, I sometimes hear that whisper, "Still working." Story the end. It was the spring of 2019 when I started a night security job at an old electronics warehouse in suburban Detroit. The building had been empty for nearly a decade, a relic of a company that had gone under, and the new owners only kept it for storage and insurance purposes. My shifts were 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., solo with the occasional daytime maintenance check. I didn't mind the solitude. It was peaceful, almost meditative. That is, until the second week on the job. The first few nights were boring, as expected. I did rounds, checked cameras, and logged entries. The building was mostly empty, except for some storage rooms on the second floor filled with dusty shelves, old equipment, and broken electronics. The first night, I noticed that the motion sensors on the second floor hallway sometimes went off without reason. At first, I chalked it up to faulty wiring. This was an old building, after all. By the fourth night, something felt off. I was patrolling the second floor when I heard a faint metallic scraping from the far end of the hallway. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I walked slowly toward it, flashlight in hand. Nothing. Just empty shelves and the stale air. I radioed my supervisor, Mike, in the front office. Hey, I think a door or something moved on the second floor. Probably the wind, he said casually. That place is old. Stuff shifts. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as I continued my patrol, the scraping sound came again, this time followed by a whisper, a soft, breathy hello that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I kept moving, trying to shake it off. When I got back to the security office, I reviewed the camera feed. On the monitor for the second floor hallway, a shadow passed the lens, a tall, thin shape moving fast, almost like a blur. I froze. There should have been no one there. The next night, the events escalated. Around 2 a.m., I noticed the fire exit door on the south side of the building was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it during my last patrol. I approached slowly, radio ready, flashlight on. As I neared the door, a cold gust of air swept past me, and the door slammed shut behind me with enough force to rattle the windows. I jumped back, heart hammering. The lights flickered, and the monitors went out for a few seconds before coming back on. When I checked the footage of the south exit, the feed was clear, empty. But I could have sworn I saw movement in the corner of the frame just before it went dark. By the third week, I had started hearing things regularly. Footsteps in empty hallways. The faint sound of typing coming from an abandoned office filled with dust-covered computers. Doors creaking open and closing on their own. Every time I checked the cameras, the feeds showed nothing. One night, around 3:30 a.m., I was sitting in the security office watching the monitors when all of them went black simultaneously. The lights in the room dimmed, leaving me in near darkness. Then I heard it, a whisper, right behind me. Why are you here? I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty office. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the hallway outside the office. Empty. I radioed Mike. No answer. The static on the line was louder than usual, almost like a whisper. I continued my patrol, every nerve on edge. On the second floor, I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, tall, thin, shrouded in shadows. It didn't move. I stopped, flashlight trembling in my hand, my breath fogged in the cold air. Then, slowly, it started walking toward me. I backed away. The figure moved faster than I expected, gliding rather than walking. I ran. My boots echoed on the concrete floor as I sprinted toward the stairwell. When I reached the bottom, the lobby was empty, but the air was thick, heavy, and cold, like I had stepped into a freezer. I stayed in the office for the rest of the night, shaking, listening to the empty building groan and creak. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. The following night, I decided to leave the office and investigate one last time. Around 1 a.m., I was walking the first floor corridors when I heard a distinct sound, a child laughing. It echoed softly, distant but clear. The warehouse had no reason for a child to be there. I followed the sound, and it led me to an old storage room at the back, filled with broken furniture and discarded electronics. The laughter stopped abruptly when I opened the door. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, but the temperature dropped sharply, and I saw something on the wall, letters scratched into the paint. Go back. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, empty. But the whisper returned, you shouldn't be here. I ran out of the building and didn't stop until I reached my car. I didn't return that night. The next day, I resigned. Weeks later, I heard that a new guard who replaced me vanished during his shift. His car was found in the parking lot, keys in the ignition, but no one ever found him. Some say the warehouse is cursed, that the spirits of previous workers who died there roam the halls. I don't know. All I know is that place wasn't just haunted. It was alive, aware, waiting. I still have nightmares about it. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the whisper, why are you here? I'll never work a night shift alone again. Story the end. I used to work as a security guard at a large corporate office complex just outside of Dallas, Texas. It wasn't one of those bustling, high-rise places full of people during the day. This one was a little different. 3 buildings sitting in a mostly empty industrial park that had been half abandoned since the early 2000s. The company that owned it rented out office space to smaller businesses. accounting firms, tech startups, medical record storage. During the day, there were maybe a few hundred people spread across all three buildings. At night, though, it was just me. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Monday through Friday. My responsibilities were simple: patrol the property, check that all doors were secure, and monitor the cameras from the central security office in Building A. Each building had its own alarm system, and my main task was to respond to any triggered motion sensors or alarms that went off after hours. Most of the time, that meant chasing out raccoons or dealing with malfunctioning sensors. The first few weeks were fine. It was quiet, lonely, and sometimes boring. Exactly what I wanted. I had taken the job after quitting a warehouse position that was eating me alive, mentally and physically. I liked the solitude. The silence was a relief. Then, about a month in, things started getting strange. The first incident happened in late March. It was a Thursday night, about 2:30 a.m. I was watching the monitors when I saw motion in the lobby of Building B. The lights were supposed to stay off after midnight, but one of the hallway lights had flicked on. I zoomed in on the camera feed, expecting to see a cleaning crew that had forgotten to log out, but the cleaners only came on Tuesdays and Fridays. The camera view was grainy, washed in green from the night vision, but I saw what looked like a person standing near the elevator. They were facing the wall. At first, I thought maybe it was a reflection or some kind of optical glitch, so I watched for a few seconds. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, completely still, facing the wall like a child in trouble. I radioed the situation to my supervisor, but no one answered. He was off that night. So I grabbed my flashlight, keys, and radio and drove the golf cart over to Building B. When I got inside, the lobby was dark. The motion-activated lights flickered on as I entered. My footsteps echoed across the tile. I checked near the elevator, by the spot where I'd seen the person standing. No one was there. But on the wall just above the baseboard, there was a long black smear, like someone had pressed their hands against it and dragged them downward. The marks were greasy, maybe from oil or soot. I touched one finger to it. It was sticky, like tar. The smell that came off it was awful, sweet and metallic like burnt sugar mixed with rust. I stepped back, trying to keep my stomach from turning. I checked the rest of the floor, the stairwell, the bathrooms, all empty. When I went back to the security office and replayed the footage, the figure wasn't there anymore. The smear, however, clearly was. The next morning, I mentioned it to the property manager. She said one of the upper floors had a fire about a decade ago, long before she started working there. A man had been badly burned in the incident, a maintenance worker trapped in an electrical room. She didn't know much more, but her expression made me think she'd heard stories before. Over the next week, the motion sensors in Building B started tripping more frequently, always between 2 and 3 a.m. Sometimes the camera would flicker on for a moment, showing an empty hallway, except the exit light would be swinging slightly, like someone had just walked underneath it. Other times, the elevators would move between floors by themselves, doors opening to dark, empty hallways. One night, I was sitting in the office reviewing paperwork when the Building B alarm went off again. This time, it was a Zone 2 utility corridor, one of the sub-level maintenance hallways. That was new. I sighed, grabbed my flashlight, and drove over. The maintenance corridor was an ugly concrete tunnel that ran behind the offices and led to the electrical and boiler rooms. Hardly anyone went down there. As soon as I opened the access door, I smelled it again, that same burnt metallic odor. The air was thick and warm, even though the rest of the building was freezing. I started walking slowly, my boots crunching on bits of dust and paint chips. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing pipes overhead and long, low shadows stretching across the walls. Then I heard it, a slow tapping sound. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I called out, "Hello? This is security." No response. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I turned the corner and froze. At the end of the hallway stood a man, or at least what looked like one. His clothes were blackened and torn, his arms hanging at odd angles. His head was bowed slightly, and in the dim light his skin looked burned, raw and shiny as if it had melted. "Sir?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure turned its head toward me, and I saw what looked like half a face, one eye missing, the other reflecting the beam of my flashlight like glass. The mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Then suddenly, the overhead lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. I stood there for nearly a minute, heart pounding, before I forced myself to walk to the end of the corridor. Nothing, just the empty hallway, the smell of scorched metal, and the faint outline of a handprint burned into the concrete wall. When I reviewed the camera feed from that area later, it was corrupted, nothing but static. I started dreading the night shift after that. Every little noise made my skin crawl. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps echoing through the halls of Building B when I was still outside. Other times, the elevator doors would open as I passed by, even though I hadn't pressed a button. A week later, something happened that made me nearly quit on the spot. It was raining that night, heavy and cold. Around 3:10 a.m., I was inside Building A when the fire alarm in Building B started blaring. I grabbed my raincoat and sprinted across the parking lot. The moment I entered the lobby, the alarm stopped, dead silent. I checked the panel. It showed the fire had originated on the third floor, office 3B07, but that suite had been vacant for months. When I got to the third floor, the hallway was pitch dark. My flashlight beam illuminated small drops of water scattered along the carpet, but it wasn't rainwater. It was thick and dark, more like oil. The smell of burnt plastic filled the air. I followed the droplets to the door of 3B07. The handle was ice cold, even though the building's heating was still running. I took a deep breath, turned the key, and pushed the door open. The office was empty, completely bare except for a few metal filing cabinets. But the walls were scorched. Not fresh burns, but old, blackened streaks trailing up toward the ceiling. Then I saw movement in the reflection of one of the windows. Behind me, in the glass, stood the same burned figure. It was standing inches away, its reflection clearer than reality. The face was blistered, the mouth open wider than it should have been. Before I could turn around, a voice, low, ragged, and broken, whispered right in my ear, "Get out." The window shattered inward with a deafening crack. I dropped to the floor as shards rained down. When I looked up again, the room was empty. I don't remember running down the stairs. I just remember stumbling into the parking lot, gasping for air in the cold rain. I filed the report later, but the site manager brushed it off. They said the alarm system had malfunctioned due to moisture, and that I'd probably been startled by the thunder. But the broken window wasn't from thunder. And that voice, that whisper, it wasn't something I imagined. A few nights later, I came across something that confirmed I wasn't losing my mind. I was going through some archived reports in the security office when I found a binder labeled Incident Logs 2008. Inside, several entries caught my eye. They all mentioned Building B, and one name appeared again and again, Thomas J. Keller, maintenance supervisor. The notes described multiple false fire alarms, strange smells, and reports of heat signatures detected after hours. One log from November 2008 mentioned a severe electrical malfunction in the sublevel corridor. The last entry was dated December 12, 2008. Open quote, "Employee Keller found deceased in electrical room after fire suppression system failure. Cause of death, thermal injuries. Fire isolated to maintenance corridor. Building reopens 12:20. Close quote. I sat there, staring at that line, my pulse pounding. The corridor. The same one where I'd seen him. That night, I brought my phone with me and secretly recorded my patrol through Building B. I didn't expect much, maybe some sounds or shadows. But around 2:47 a.m., the footage caught something. In the video, I'm walking down the second floor hallway, flashlight aimed forward. For a moment, everything's still. Then, faintly behind me in the reflection of a glass door, a figure appears, tall, burned, head tilted sideways. As I move forward, the reflection doesn't. It stays there, staring. I didn't notice it until I reviewed the footage later. By early April, I couldn't take it anymore. The nightly disturbances grew worse. Lights flickering, doors slamming, alarms tripping with no cause. The smell of smoke and that burnt sweetness lingered constantly. My last night on the job, I told myself I'd get through one final shift. Then I'd hand in my keys and never come back. That night around 3 a.m., every motion alarm on Building B went off at once. The monitors showed chaos. Lights flashing in every corridor, elevator doors opening and closing, and for a brief moment on one of the feeds, I saw him again, standing in the lobby, head bowed, smoke rising faintly from his body. Then all the power cut out. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside. The air was thick with the smell of burning insulation, though there was no fire. As I turned toward Building B, every window on the third floor glowed red, like they were lit from inside. I stood there, frozen, as I heard faint banging, slow, steady, echoing from within. Then a voice came through my radio, crackling through static. "Control room, Keller here. Can you hear me?" The voice was deep, rough, but calm. I froze. No one named Keller worked there anymore. "This is Keller. Fire in the corridor. Can't get out." I dropped the radio and ran for my car. I didn't stop until I was miles away. The next morning, I went to return my badge. The property manager said the entire alarm system had shorted overnight, likely from a power surge. No fires had been reported. But she mentioned something odd. The building's sprinklers had gone off on their own, triggered by intense heat on the third floor. When the maintenance crew went in to reset them, they found the word "leave" burned into one of the office doors, melted right into the paint. I quit that day and never went back. A few weeks later, I looked up the old fire report from 2008. It confirmed everything. The worker, Thomas Keller, had died trying to shut down a breaker panel that exploded from an electrical overload. Witnesses said he'd been trapped by the flames. The report noted something chilling in the witness statements. Open quote, "Other maintenance staff reported hearing Keller's voice over the PA system hours after the fire was extinguished, calling for help." Close quote. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that hallway, the smell, the heat, and that whisper behind me telling me to get out. And when I wake up, I swear I can still smell smoke. Story the end. I started working as a security guard at the old Preston Industrial Park in the fall of 2017. It wasn't the kind of job I dreamed about, but I needed something steady and quiet while I figured out what to do next with my life. The industrial park had once been a bustling place back in the 80s and 90s, full of small manufacturing companies and repair shops, but by the time I started, most of the buildings were abandoned, leased out only to storage companies and a few trucking outfits that operated during the day. My shift started at 6 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., 12 long hours of silence, surveillance, and patrols. There were 2 of us on the payroll for nights, me and another guy named Walt, but we never worked together. We alternated shifts, meaning I'd have Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, while he took the other days. That schedule was supposed to save the company money, though I always wondered if it was because no one wanted to pay for 2 guards in a place that saw maybe 3 visitors a night. My job was simple. Keep an eye on the warehouses, check the doors and gates, write up hourly logs, and report any suspicious activity. The place was surrounded by an 8-foot chain link fence with razor wire on top, and each gate was secured by heavy padlocks. A small guard shack sat near the main entrance, equipped with an old desktop computer linked to the security camera feeds, a busted coffee maker, and a small space heater that groaned like an old man whenever I turned it on. The first few weeks were boring but manageable. I brought a thermos of coffee, a paperback book, and sometimes streamed old police procedural shows on my phone when I was sure the supervisor wasn't checking the camera logs. There were raccoons that wandered near the dumpsters, a few stray cats that I started feeding bits of my sandwich to, and the occasional truck driver who came by after hours to drop off something they forgot earlier. Then, about 3 weeks into the job, things started getting strange. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was finishing my second round of patrols. I usually started at the guard shack, walked along the perimeter fence, checked the padlocks on the warehouse doors, then circled back to the small loading docks on the far end. It took about 30 minutes if I didn't stop. That night, when I rounded the corner near Building 4, the largest warehouse on the lot, I heard something metallic clanging from inside. At first, I thought it might have been the wind. The roof panels creaked whenever the temperature dropped, and sometimes the loose gutters rattled. But this was different. It was rhythmic, like someone striking a pipe against metal in a steady beat. 3 strikes, pause, 2 more. I stood still for a few seconds, my flashlight cutting through the dark, shining across the side of the building. I radioed in to the control line, a number that went straight to the night supervisor's voicemail, and left a short message that I was investigating a noise near Building 4. Then I went closer. The loading dock doors were shut tight, padlocks in place, but the noise was definitely coming from inside. It echoed through the metal walls. I pressed my ear against one of the roll-up doors and froze when I heard what sounded like movement, slow, deliberate footsteps scraping across the concrete floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding much smaller than I wanted it to. "Security, anyone in there?" The noise stopped. Silence filled the space. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, waiting for some kind of reply, but nothing came. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I finally backed away, shining my light toward the corners and checking the padlocks again. They were untouched. I took a picture with my phone from my log report and headed back to the shack. When I reviewed the footage from the camera facing Building 4, there was nothing. The motion sensors hadn't triggered. No one had gone in or out. I told myself it was probably an animal or something shifting inside, some old machinery maybe. But I couldn't shake that steady, deliberate rhythm I'd heard. The next few nights were uneventful, and I started to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then the radio started acting up. The company-issued radio had a range of about a mile, plenty for the size of the property, but sometimes it would emit a burst of static, followed by faint whispering. The first time it happened, I thought I was picking up interference from a nearby trucker's CB radio. But then one night, around 3 a.m., while I was writing in my log, the static came through again, only this time it wasn't random. It sounded like a voice, faint but clear enough to make out fragments of words. "Don't, go inside." I froze. I picked up the radio and said, "Control, this is Unit 1. "Say again." Nothing, just silence. Then static again, followed by a long, distorted tone that sounded like someone breathing close to the microphone. I turned the volume down and stared at the radio for a long time. When my shift ended at 6, I mentioned it to the day guard, an older guy named Frank. He chuckled and said, "Yeah, that happens sometimes. You're probably picking up an open channel. Happened to me a few times when I covered nights. Don't worry about it." So I didn't, not for a while. But that didn't stop things from getting worse. About a week later, I found one of the padlocks on Building 4 hanging open. That was impossible. The only keys were kept in the guard shack safe, and I had both the gate key and the master key on my ring. I double-checked the lock and saw no signs of forced entry, no scratches, no dents, just open, swinging lightly in the wind. I opened the roll-up door a few inches and shined my flashlight inside. The beam cut across a wide, empty floor littered with old pallets and dust. The place smelled like oil and mildew. Then for a split second I saw movement in the far corner, a dark shape that darted behind a stack of crates. I stepped back fast, my flashlight shaking. "Security!" I shouted again. "If anyone's in there, come out!" No answer. I should have called the police right then, but I hesitated. My supervisor had made it clear they hated false alarms. The last guard who'd called in for something that turned out to be nothing got written up and eventually fired. So instead, I locked the door back up, logged the incident, and went back to the shack. But I couldn't stop thinking about that movement I saw. Over the next several nights, I noticed things inside the warehouse's shifting position. A stack of pallets that used to be neatly arranged near the door was suddenly toppled. A metal chair that had been against one wall was now sitting dead center in the floor. Once, when I walked by the long-windowed corridor between buildings 3 and 4, I swore I saw someone standing inside, just a faint outline near the glass. I shined my light that way, but it was gone. Then came the night that changed everything. It was early November, cold enough that the air stung when I breathed. The fog was thick, clinging to the ground like smoke. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the alarm from Building 4 go off, a loud, piercing siren that made my heart jump. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and keys and ran across the lot. When I reached the building, the door was still locked, padlock intact. The siren continued blaring. I entered the code on the alarm box to silence it and checked the control panel. It said, "Motion detected, Interior Zone 2." That section covered the back half of the warehouse where the old offices were located. I hesitated for a long moment before unlocking the door. Every instinct told me to wait for backup, but there wasn't any. I was alone. So I rolled up the door and stepped inside. The air was stale and cold. My boots echoed across the concrete as I swept the flashlight left and right. Dust floated in the beam. The offices were still there, their glass windows cracked and covered in grime. As I got closer to the back, I saw a flicker of light, like someone holding a small flashlight or a lighter. It disappeared almost instantly. "Hello? This is security!" I shouted. "You're trespassing! Come out now before I call the police!" No answer. I moved toward the office hallway, every nerve screaming to turn around. The fog from outside had crept in through the cracks under the doors, creating a thin mist near the floor. My flashlight caught something dark smeared across the glass of one office door. I stepped closer and realized it was handprints, black, oily, uneven. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised, but there was nothing. Just my own breath, fogging in the cold air. The footsteps stopped as soon as I turned. "Who's there?" I yelled again, louder this time. Something moved fast down the hallway, a shadow slipping past the doorframes. I heard the door at the end slam shut. I ran after it, my flashlight bouncing off the walls, heart hammering. The door led to the storage area. I burst through it, expecting to see someone hiding, but the room was empty. Completely empty. Except for the smell. It was thick, metallic, like rust and blood. That was when the radio on my belt crackled to life again, even though I hadn't touched it. Through the static came that same faint voice. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. "Who is this?" I whispered. The radio hissed. Then a deep, distorted voice came through again, barely audible. "Behind you." I turned so fast I nearly fell. The beam of my flashlight swung wildly across the empty floor. There was no one there, but for just a second I saw a shape, darker than the shadows, crouched low near the far corner. It vanished the moment the light hit it. That was it. I bolted out of the building and didn't stop until I reached the shack. I locked the door behind me, breathing hard. I sat there, staring at the monitor showing the camera feeds. One of the feeds, the one for Building 4's interior, was flickering. Then, right there on the screen, I saw movement. The same hallway I'd just been in. A shadow moving slowly past the camera. It wasn't walking like a person. It glided, almost floating, but its outline was unmistakable. I stared at the screen, unable to move. Then the figure stopped directly in front of the camera and turned, like it was looking straight into the lens. Its face, or what should have been a face, was nothing but darkness. The screen went black. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning. She told me to file a written report, then said she'd have maintenance check the camera. When I came back that night, the footage from that hour was gone. Deleted. She told me the DVR must have glitched. After that, everything in that place felt wrong. The air felt heavier. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was expectant, like something waiting to happen. Sometimes I'd catch the faint sound of whispering over the radio or see movement on the edge of the cameras that vanished when I zoomed in. The final night I worked there was December 12th. It started like any other shift. Cold, quiet, routine. Around midnight, I was sitting in the shack writing my report when all the lights across the property flickered and went out. Total blackout. The computer screens went dark. Only the emergency backup light stayed on, glowing a dull red. I radioed for assistance, but all I got was static. Then, faintly, I heard that voice again. Closer this time, almost whispering directly into my ear through the static. "We're still inside." I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The fog had rolled in thick again, swallowing the parking lot. I could barely see 10 feet ahead. Every sound seemed magnified. The crunch of gravel, the distant creak of metal. As I approached Building 4, I saw something that stopped me cold. The roll-up door was wide open. I knew I'd locked it. I double-checked every building before the power went out. My hands were shaking as I raised the flashlight. The beam lit up the open doorway, the darkness inside stretching endlessly. Then I saw them. Footprints. Bare, wet footprints leading from inside the building out into the fog. They glistened faintly on the concrete, like they'd just been made. I followed them a few steps, but they disappeared into the mist halfway across the lot. I turned to go back to the shack, but the door was already open. The light inside flickered weakly, and I could see movement. Slow, shifting, like something pacing. I called out, "Who's in there?" My voice cracked. No answer. I stepped closer, flashlight trembling. The inside of the shack was empty, except for the monitor. The security feed was back on, and every camera showed the same thing, the interior of Building 4. And in the middle of the frame, standing motionless, was that same dark figure. It was closer to the camera this time, almost clear. I could see its outline, a tall, thin shape, head tilted slightly, limbs too long to be human. The longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed, like it was somehow shifting even when it wasn't moving. Then, slowly, it raised its arm and pointed directly at the camera. The same second, the light in the shack went out, and the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. I turned to run, but something moved behind me. I felt the air stir. I didn't look. I just ran across the lot, past the open gate, down the road until I reached the main street. When I looked back, the fog had swallowed the whole industrial park. The lights came back on, one by one, glowing dimly through the mist like eyes. I quit the next morning. No notice, no explanation. Just left my badge on the desk and walked out. I found out a few months later that the company stopped using that property for storage altogether. Apparently, a fire broke out in Building 4 one night. The fire department couldn't figure out the cause, said it started somewhere deep inside, even though the building had no active power at the time. No one was hurt, but one of the firefighters reported hearing something strange over their radio during the response. Static at first, then a faint voice saying, "We're still inside. I don't work security anymore. I can't." Even years later, I still wake up at night thinking I hear that same rhythmic metallic sound echoing in the dark. 3 strikes, pause, 2 more. And sometimes, when the room is quiet enough, I swear I can hear breathing through the static of my old handheld radio, even though it hasn't had batteries in it for years. Story the end. I started working security at the North Point Distribution Center in late 2018, a few months after moving from Chicago to the outskirts of St. Louis. I was 34, recently divorced, and trying to start over. The company that hired me, Iron Shield Security, wasn't exactly known for its high standards, but they paid on time and didn't ask too many questions. The job itself sounded simple. 12-hour night shifts patrolling a massive warehouse complex that was mostly empty after dark. My supervisor, a tired-looking guy named Rick, told me on my first night, "You'll probably spend most of your time bored. Keep an eye on the cameras, do your rounds, and don't fall asleep. That's it." The facility sat about 2 miles off the main road, surrounded by chain-link fencing and woods that stretched for acres. During the day, the place buzzed with trucks, forklifts, and warehouse workers. But at night, it was dead silent, except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional scurry of raccoons. I was alone most nights, and that suited me fine. I wasn't a people person anymore. The first few weeks went by uneventfully. My shift started at 6 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. I'd clock in at the small security office near the main gate, check the camera feeds, then make my first patrol through the loading docks and storage aisles. The warehouse stretched nearly a quarter of a mile long, with concrete floors, metal shelving, and massive bay doors that faced the truck yard. It always smelled faintly of oil and dust. My flashlight would catch particles floating in the air like slow-moving snow. It wasn't until my 3rd week that I started noticing odd things. At first, I brushed them off. A door left open when I was sure I'd closed it. A pallet jack parked in the middle of an aisle that hadn't been there 10 minutes before. The sound of a radio crackling softly somewhere in the building, even though I was the only one on duty. The place had weird acoustics, sometimes noises from one end of the warehouse carried all the way to the other. Still, something about it didn't feel right. One night around 2 a.m., I was doing my 2nd patrol. I had a little routine: start from the security office, walk along the dock doors, cut through the main storage lanes, then check the far end near the maintenance rooms before circling back. That night, when I got to the far end, I heard a distinct metallic clank, like something being dropped. It came from one of the side corridors where the lighting was dimmer. I froze for a second, thinking maybe a worker had stayed late. But when I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" the sound of my own voice just echoed back. I turned my flashlight toward the corridor and saw nothing. The sound had come from near a maintenance door marked "Electrical Access, Authorized Personnel Only." The door was slightly ajar. just enough that I could see the edge of a toolbox inside. I pushed it open and scanned the room. Everything looked normal. Wires, panels, a workbench, and a few scattered tools. I chalked it up to vibration from the ventilation system knocking something over. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something on the wall. In thick black marker, someone had written, "He doesn't like when you're alone." It wasn't large, maybe 6 inches tall, written in a hurried scrawl next to the fuse box. I stood there staring at it for a moment, unsure if it had been there before. The room smelled faintly of ozone and something else, like burnt plastic. I took a quick photo on my phone to show Rick later and closed the door, making a mental note to mention it in my report. The next morning, when Rick came to relieve me, I showed him the photo. He squinted at it and said, "We've had contractors in and out doing electrical work, probably one of them being an idiot. I'll have maintenance paint over it." He laughed it off, but the way his eyes lingered on the picture made me think he knew something he wasn't saying. Over the next few weeks, the little incidents continued. One night, the camera feed for aisle 6 flickered for nearly an hour. The image kept glitching, showing brief frames of movement. Something dark crossing in front of the lens, too fast to make out. I went to check the aisle, but found it empty. Another night, all the lights in the northeast corner shut off simultaneously, plunging that section into complete darkness. When I got there, the breakers hadn't tripped. The lights just came back on by themselves a minute later. I tried telling myself it was all electrical issues, old wiring, faulty sensors, maybe even rodents. But then came the night I saw the man in the blue jumpsuit. It was a cold February night, one of those when the wind howls through the loading bay doors. Around 3 a.m., I was watching the security monitors, sipping coffee, when I noticed movement on camera 9, one of the exterior feeds facing the side gate. A man in a blue maintenance jumpsuit was walking along the perimeter fence. He wasn't carrying a flashlight, which immediately caught my attention. I radioed, "Control to north perimeter, identify yourself." Nothing. I watched him stop near the gate, stand perfectly still for about 15 seconds, and then turn his head toward the camera. Even though the footage was grainy, I could swear his face looked wrong, like it was blurred or distorted, but not from the camera, just wrong. I blinked, leaned closer, and the feed went static. When it came back, the man was gone. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. The air was freezing. My breath came out in white clouds. I walked along the fence line to where I'd seen him. The gravel crunched under my boots, and the security lights buzzed faintly overhead. When I reached the side gate, it was closed, the padlock still in place, but the ground below it looked disturbed, like someone had been standing there. There were faint impressions in the gravel, shoe prints leading up to the gate, but none leading away. I radioed Rick, who was on call for emergencies. "You sure you saw someone?" he asked. "We've got motion sensors out there. Nothing tripped." "I saw him clear as day," I said. "Blue jumpsuit. Looked like maintenance." "Well, nobody's scheduled. Maybe a trespasser. Just keep an eye on the feed." I went back inside, unsettled. When I rewound the footage to show him later, the recording was gone. That camera's entire hour-long segment had been corrupted. Black screen, no audio, no timestamp. I didn't mention it again. After that night, things escalated. I started hearing footsteps when I did my rounds, slow, deliberate ones that followed a few seconds behind me. I'd spin around, shine my light down the aisle, and there'd be nothing but the faint echo of my own breathing. Sometimes I'd swear I heard someone whispering, too faint to make out words. One night, I left my coffee mug on the security desk when I went for a quick restroom break. When I came back, it was sitting on the floor, empty, as if someone had poured it out carefully. I began keeping my phone camera on me during patrols, just in case. The building's atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by cameras, not by intruders, but by something else that knew the rhythm of my shifts, the sound of my steps, and when I was alone. One morning after my shift, I caught Rick in his office. He looked exhausted. I decided to confront him. "I know this sounds crazy," I said, "but there's something wrong with that place. The cameras glitch, lights go out, things move around on their own. I've seen someone out there, twice now." He rubbed his temples. "You saw him again?" "Yes." Last night, he was standing near the northeast bay door. I thought it was one of the contractors, but when I got closer, he just disappeared. Rick sighed and looked at the floor for a moment before speaking. You're not the first one to say that. That caught me off guard. What do you mean? He leaned back in his chair. A few years ago, before you started, we had another guard, Sam Carter. Good worker, ex-military. He was on the night shift too. Around 2014, I think. One morning, he didn't clock out. Police found his truck still parked by the main gate, lights on, engine running. They found his flashlight halfway down aisle 10. No trace of him anywhere. Cameras didn't catch a thing. What happened to him? Never found. The company brought in extra cameras, rewired the lights, even had priests bless the place. We thought maybe he wandered off, but the dogs couldn't pick up a scent. His locker's still in the back if you want to see it. I didn't know what to say. It was like the air left the room. That night, when I returned to work, I couldn't stop thinking about Sam. I asked one of the day guards, a quiet guy named Henry, if he remembered him. Henry nodded slowly. Yeah, I remember. Sam used to say he heard someone calling his name down in the loading bays. Said there was a man who'd watch him from the dark corners. We thought he was losing it. Then one morning, he was just gone. That night, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I opened Sam's old locker. It was still at the far end of the employee corridor, untouched for years. The metal door was dusty, and the combination lock had been broken off. Inside was his old flashlight, some paperwork, and a small notebook. The first few pages were filled with shift logs. Normal stuff like 2 a.m. patrol completed, nothing to report. But as I flipped through, the entries changed tone. They got frantic. March 12th, 2014, saw the man again. Blue jumpsuit. Doesn't move like a person. March 20th, voices in the vents. They say my name. March 29th, Rick doesn't believe me. He's here every night now, closer and closer. Don't look in the reflection. The last entry was smeared as if written in a rush. If you see him, don't turn around. I put the notebook back and locked the door behind me, but I couldn't unsee those words. The warehouse felt different after that, heavier somehow. Every shadow seemed to twitch at the corner of my vision. Every sound made me jump. I started carrying an extra flashlight and a small knife, though I knew neither would help if whatever this was wanted to hurt me. Then came the night everything reached its breaking point. It was mid-March, about a month after I'd found the notebook. A winter storm was rolling in, and the wind howled around the building. Around midnight, the power went out. Just like that. Complete darkness, the hum of the lights replaced by an awful silence. The backup generators kicked in after a few seconds, but only half the lights came back on. Most of the security monitors were dead. The only feed still working showed the loading bay. That's when I saw him again. The man in the blue jumpsuit stood in the middle of the dock, facing the camera. His head was tilted slightly, and he wasn't moving. I could see his outline perfectly this time, clear and sharp in the flickering light. His face was pale, almost gray, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink into shadow. I tried calling out over the intercom, but my voice cracked. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." No response. He just stood there. Then he started walking, slowly, deliberately toward the camera. As he moved, the lights above him flickered and went dark one by one, following his path. I backed away from the monitors, heart pounding. When the last light went out, the feed cut to static. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the loading bay. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was ice cold, colder than it should have been. My breath fogged. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to keep going. The beam of my flashlight caught something on the floor. Wet footprints, bare, leading toward the storage aisles. I followed them. The footprints stopped at aisle 10, the same aisle where Sam's flashlight had been found. I swept my light down the long stretch of shelving. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional drip of water somewhere in the distance. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice echoed endlessly. No answer. I turned to leave, but something moved at the end of the aisle. It was subtle. A shift in the shadows, a flicker of blue. I raised the flashlight, but the beam dimmed suddenly, like the batteries were dying. My heart hammered. The figure was standing there, watching me. I could barely make out his features, but I saw enough. The jumpsuit, the pale face, and something that looked like a deep black hole where his eyes should have been. He whispered something. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it sounded like my name. I stumbled backward, tripping over a pallet. My flashlight hit the ground and went out. In the darkness, I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I scrambled to my feet and ran, half blind, slamming into a wall as I tried to find the exit. The footsteps followed, echoing through the corridor. When I finally burst into the main hall, the emergency lights flickered back on. The air seemed to shift, like a pressure lifting. The sound stopped. I turned around. The aisle was empty. I didn't finish my shift that night. I called Rick, told him there was a security breach, and waited outside by my car until dawn. When he arrived, I told him everything. The man, the voices, the footprints. He didn't laugh this time. He just looked tired. "You should take a few nights off," he said quietly. "You've been under a lot of stress." But when I came back a few days later, the warehouse was sealed off. A notice on the gate said, "Facility closed for maintenance." I tried calling Rick, but his number was disconnected. A few weeks later, I learned from another guard that Iron Shield had pulled all personnel from the site after an incident. Nobody would tell me what kind. A month passed. I couldn't shake it. I kept dreaming about the warehouse, the long aisles, the flickering lights, the whisper of footsteps behind me. In one dream, I'd turn around and see the man in the blue jumpsuit standing inches away, his face hollow and wet, whispering, "You shouldn't have looked." Out of morbid curiosity, I drove back there one night. The road was blocked with a chain, but I parked and walked the rest of the way. The building loomed in the distance, dark and silent. The moonlight reflected off the cracked windows. The main gate hung open slightly, the padlock broken. I thought I heard something moving inside. Something dragging. I didn't go any closer. A few months later, I moved out of state. Got a day job at a smaller facility with other guards on shift. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm walking past the storage aisles, I catch a glimpse of blue out of the corner of my eye. Always behind me. Always just far enough away that I can tell myself it's a trick of the light. But deep down, I know better. Story the end. I got my first real security job in the summer of 2019, working nights at an old industrial complex just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. It was one of those sprawling, partially abandoned properties, 3 massive warehouses, some older office buildings, and a fenced-in shipping yard. The daytime tenants were few: a small logistics company, a furniture storage business, and a self-storage operator who rented out units in the oldest building. At night, it was just me, a small security office in the front lot, and acres of empty asphalt and concrete. My shifts ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and most of the time it was boring. I patrolled the fence lines, checked the doors, monitored the cameras, and called in any alarms. The facility had been around since the 1970s, and everything felt like it was held together with duct tape and old wiring. The cameras were grainy black and white models, and the floodlights flickered more than they stayed on. The first few weeks were fine. Nothing out of the ordinary. I'd drive the golf cart around the property, shine my flashlight down the alleyways between warehouses, and check the locks. Sometimes raccoons or stray cats would trigger the motion sensors, and that was usually the extent of it. Then one night in mid-July, things started to get off. It was around 1:45 a.m. when I noticed something strange on the monitor for Warehouse 2. The camera caught a figure standing near one of the shipping doors. It was dark, blurry, and at first I assumed it was a glitch, but the figure didn't flicker or distort like the usual static. It just stood there, motionless. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and went over to check. When I arrived, the door was locked and the area was empty. No sign of anyone entering or leaving, but there were footprints in the dust, bare, wet prints leading to the door and stopping abruptly. I radioed my supervisor, but the line was dead. Just static. I chalked it up to stress. Maybe I was imagining things. But over the next few nights, the incidents increased. Doors I had double-checked would be open the next time I passed. Motion sensors would go off in empty hallways. I'd hear footsteps echoing behind me when I was alone in the office. Then came the smell. It started faintly, like something burning or rotting, coming from the sub-level storage in Warehouse 2. I checked the area with my flashlight, shining it down narrow hallways and into small utility rooms. Nothing. No dead animals, no leaking chemicals, just the smell, sweet, metallic, and unmistakably wrong. One night, while doing my rounds, I found what I can only describe as handprints, blackened, smudged against the walls of the corridor leading to the maintenance rooms. They were vertical, like someone had pressed their hands against the surface and slid down. I touched one. Cold, sticky. I pulled back my hand immediately. I started keeping detailed notes after that. Times, locations, smells, sounds. Almost every incident happened between 1:30 a.m. and 3 a.m., mostly around Warehouse 2. Then on July 23rd, it got terrifying. It was around 2 a.m., and I was at the office reviewing the camera feeds when the entire monitor went blank, except for one feed, Warehouse 2. The image was grainy, but there was movement. I saw a figure emerge from the shadows, barefoot, hunched, wearing what looked like an old jumpsuit. His face was obscured, but the shape of his head and the way he moved, slow, deliberate, made my stomach knot. I left the office with my flashlight and drove the golf cart over. As I approached the warehouse, the temperature dropped suddenly. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. The door to Warehouse 2 was partially open. I was certain I had locked it. I stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Sweet, metallic, rotting. My flashlight caught a figure in the distance, standing perfectly still. It was him, the same man I'd seen on the camera. His face was pale, grayish, almost waxy. His jumpsuit was old, oil-stained, torn in places. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. Then he moved, slowly, one step at a time. The sound of his bare feet on the concrete was wet, sticky. I turned to run, but the exit was suddenly blocked, a shadow across the doorway that wasn't mine. "Still working," he whispered. The words echoed inside my head, low and broken. I scrambled back, barely making it to the office. I called in, not on the radio, on my personal phone, trying to explain, but no one believed me. They assumed I'd seen a trespasser, a prankster. But I knew better. After that, I couldn't sleep properly. Every night, I would drive past Warehouse 2 on my rounds and see shadows moving inside, doors opening and closing on their own. Sometimes faint whispers, almost like someone speaking through a long tunnel, echoed down empty hallways. One night, I set up my phone to record audio while I did my patrols. When I listened back the next day, the recording was chilling. For the first 10 minutes, nothing. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of metal scraping, like someone dragging a toolbox across the concrete. Then, a voice, low, trembling, and broken. "Still working, still working." After that, I started looking into the history of the building. A maintenance worker named Robert Harlan had died there in the late 1980s. He had been crushed between a forklift and a loading dock during a night shift. The story said he'd been trapped for hours before anyone found him. Some of the older employees said they had heard his voice over the PA system after hours, calling for help. It all made sense. The motion in the cameras, the whispers, the smell. The burned gray figure I kept seeing was him. And for some reason, he was stuck in the building, reliving the moment of his death every night. I tried quitting several times. Each night I would drive past, half expecting to see him standing in the windows, watching. On my last night, I made it through the shift by staying in the office, refusing to patrol the warehouses, but at 2:37 a.m., the PA system clicked on. His voice came through, calm, steady, almost pleading, "Don't leave." I froze. My hands shook so badly I dropped the flashlight. When I picked it up, the office door was wide open. The rain was pouring outside, but the lights in the building glowed as if lit from within. I didn't wait. I ran to my car and drove off. I never went back. Months later, I read that Warehouse 2 had been condemned and was scheduled for demolition. But they didn't remove anything before knocking it down. My guess is that whatever was there, whatever Robert Harlan became, was buried under the rubble. I still get nightmares about him. The scraping metal, the whispers, the cold, wet concrete under my feet. And sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear it, that low, broken voice calling from somewhere I can't see. Story the end. It was the summer of 2016 when I took the job as a night security guard at a distribution warehouse just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. I was 29, struggling to make rent after losing a better-paying gig, and the offer came at the right time. The pay wasn't great, but the hours were steady, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and the supervisor assured me the building was quiet and easy. That was true, but not in the comforting way he meant. Quiet, yes. Too quiet. The warehouse was massive, nearly half a mile long, divided into 3 sections, with narrow aisles stacked with shelves of old shipping crates, machinery parts, and forgotten pallets that no one ever bothered to move. The company that owned it, Eagle Freight Logistics, had gone under years ago, but they still paid to keep security overnight for insurance purposes. Most nights, I was alone. My only contact was through radio check-ins every few hours with the other guard, Luis, stationed in the front office near the main gate. My first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my shift walking the perimeter, checking the cameras, and making rounds through the aisles. The hum of the fluorescent lights was constant, and the air smelled faintly of oil and dust. The only sounds were the echoes of my own footsteps. But by the end of my first week, I started noticing small, unsettling things. The cameras would flicker for a few seconds at a time, usually the ones facing the far corners of the warehouse. Tools left neatly on workbenches would be found scattered the next night. Doors that I'd locked at midnight would be slightly ajar when I passed again at 2 in the morning. At first, I figured it was Luis messing with me. He was an older guy, mid-50s, kind of a joker. When I asked him over the radio if he was walking through my section, he'd laugh. "Nope, I ain't setting foot in that place after dark, amigo. I just watch the screens. You're the brave one." That became our running joke. Me, the brave one, walking through miles of dark, empty space while he sat in the office sipping coffee. But one night around 1:30 a.m., I wasn't laughing anymore. I was doing my regular patrol through Sector C, the farthest section from the office, when I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from somewhere ahead of me. Slow, deliberate, the sound of heavy boots on concrete. I froze, my flashlight cutting through the dark between the shelves. "Luis," I said into my radio, "you sure no one's in here?" He answered immediately, his voice clear. "No one's supposed to be there but you. You hear something?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thought I heard someone walking. Probably pipes expanding," he said. "That place does it all the time. Metal shifts when it cools down." I wanted to believe him, but the sound wasn't random like creaking metal. It was steady, getting closer. I aimed my flashlight down the aisle, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone step behind one of the shelves at the far end. I called out, "Hey, security! You need to leave the building now." No response. I walked slowly toward the end of the aisle, my heartbeat loud in my ears. When I got there, the air felt colder. The next aisle over was empty. I checked both directions. Nothing. Just silence. Then my flashlight flickered. Twice. And in that brief darkness, I swore I heard a whisper right next to me, so close it brushed my ear. "Don't look." I spun around, flashlight raised, but there was no one there. Just empty air and the distant hum of the lights. My radio crackled suddenly, and I nearly jumped. "Hey," Luis said, "everything good?" I took a breath, trying to sound normal. "Yeah, must have been nothing. I'm heading back to the office for a bit." When I got back, I told Luis what had happened. He didn't laugh this time. He just looked uneasy. "You probably just heard the wind," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Then he added, "You know, the last guy who worked that shift said he used to hear things too. He quit after a month." That stuck with me. Over the next week, things escalated. Cameras would go out one by one during my patrols, only to come back online when I returned to the office. Sometimes I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of motion between the shelves, something tall and fast, always just out of sight. One night, I came across a pallet of boxes that had been moved from their usual spot. I checked the log. No shipments had been recorded for days. Then there were the cold spots. Pockets of air so frigid it felt like stepping into a freezer. They would appear suddenly, without reason, often followed by faint whispers, too quiet to make out but impossible to ignore. By my third week, I was starting to dread going to work, but I needed the money, so I kept showing up. That Thursday night, around 3 a.m., Luis called me over the radio. His voice was trembling. "Man, I need you to check something. Look at camera 12, Sector C." I jogged back to the office, eyes on the monitor. At first, I didn't see anything. The camera showed the usual empty aisle, shelves stretching into darkness. Then, movement. A figure appeared near the far end. It was standing perfectly still, facing the camera. The image was grainy, but it looked like a person wearing a dark coat or coveralls. "Who the hell is that?" I said. Luis shook his head. "No one came through the gate. I've been watching." We both stared at the screen as the figure began to move. It walked slowly toward the camera. The closer it came, the more distorted the feed became, static crawling across the image. When it reached the middle of the aisle, it stopped, then tilted its head slightly like it was listening. "Maybe it's a homeless guy," Luis whispered. But deep down, we both knew it wasn't. Then the feed cut to static completely. I grabbed my flashlight and started towards Sector C again. My gut told me not to, but it was my job. I radioed Luis as I entered the corridor. "I'm here. Nothing so far." The air felt thick, heavy. My footsteps echoed unnaturally. As I turned a corner, I noticed the temperature drop sharply. My breath hung in the air. I shined my light down the main aisle. At the far end, something moved, slowly stepping into the light. It was tall, at least 6.5 feet, its body lean and rigid. It looked like a man at first, but its face wasn't right. The features were blurred like smeared clay, no eyes or mouth I could make out, just a shape of a head. My chest tightened. "Luis," I whispered. "It's here." "What's here?" he said, his voice cracking. Before I could answer, the figure moved again. One step, then another. Each step echoed through the space, louder than seemed possible. I backed away slowly, not daring to break eye contact. My flashlight flickered. Then, as if responding to the dying light, it stopped moving and tilted its head again. The faintest whisper reached me, like a breath carried on the wind. "Why are you still here?" That was enough for me. I ran. I didn't look back until I was out in the lot, gasping for air under the orange glow of the security lights. I called Luis, shouting at him to lock the doors. When I got inside the front office, he was pale, his hands shaking. "Dude," he said, "you need to see this." He pulled up the camera feed again. The figure was gone, but every camera in Sector C was shaking slightly, as if something was walking past them, invisible but heavy enough to rattle the mounts. One by one, each feed went dark. Then a new feed lit up, the one facing the front office. There, reflected faintly in the glass door behind us, was a shape. Tall, still, watching. We both bolted for the exit, sprinting to our cars. Neither of us went back until daylight. When we finally returned, the building looked normal again. All the cameras worked. Nothing was disturbed. A week later, Luis quit. I stayed for another month, though I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself it wasn't real. But the strange activity never stopped. The whispering, the cold spots, the faint figure that appeared occasionally on the cameras. When I finally left, the company replaced me within a week. 2 weeks after that, I heard through a friend that the new guard was found unconscious during his shift, lying in the middle of Sector C. The doctor said it was shock. He never came back. The warehouse is still standing, but it's been empty for years now. The company that owned it sold the property, and no one's ever managed to keep it occupied. Some say it's because of the bad energy. Others say it's just the neighborhood. But sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about that whisper, the one that told me not to look, and I wonder what would have happened if I had. Story, the end. I took a job as a night security guard at the Redwood Business Park in central Indiana back in 2019. It was supposed to be an easy gig, just keep watch over a group of office buildings after hours, make sure no one broke in, and lock up in the morning. I'd done security work before at hospitals and a couple of factories, so I knew the routine. Stay awake, keep calm, don't let your imagination mess with you. The company was small, family-run, and they were desperate for someone to take over the midnight shift. The last guy quit abruptly after only 2 weeks. When I asked why, my supervisor, a middle-aged guy named Marv, just said, "He couldn't handle the hours. You'll be fine if you don't scare easy." Redwood had 6 buildings arranged in a horseshoe shape around a central parking lot. All of them were rented by different businesses, accounting firms, a call center, some logistics companies. At night, it was completely deserted. The only lights came from the street lamps that buzzed over the empty asphalt. My office was a small security station attached to Building D, with a bank of outdated monitors that connected to about 20 cameras. The first few nights were easy. I'd start my shift at 10 p.m., check the locks on each building, walk the perimeter, then come back to the station to watch the cameras. I'd listen to music or podcasts to stay awake. The job was boring, lonely, and quiet, the kind of quiet that starts to press on you after a while. Then, around my fourth night, I noticed something strange on the monitors. It was a little after 2 a.m., and I was watching the feed from the rear lot between buildings E and F. The camera angle was bad. It faced a dark alley with just one flickering light. In the corner of the screen, I saw what looked like a person standing there. They weren't moving, just standing near the dumpster, facing the wall. I leaned closer, thinking maybe it was a homeless person. I radioed, "Control to Lot E, identify yourself," even though I knew the system didn't reach that far. No movement. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and headed out to check. The wind was cold that night, the kind that bites through your jacket. When I got to the alley, there was nobody there, just trash bins and the sound of rustling leaves. But the weird thing was, there were wet footprints leading away from the dumpster, bare feet small like a woman's. They went about 10 feet toward the end of the alley and then stopped. I shined my light around, half expecting to see someone hiding behind the bins, but it was empty. I reported it to Marv in the morning, but he just shrugged. Probably some transient. Happens all the time. They sneak in from the highway sometimes. Don't worry about it. So I didn't. At least not until it happened again. A few nights later, around the same time, 2:15 a.m., the camera feed for that same alley flickered. For a second, I thought it had cut out completely, but when it came back, I saw her. A woman this time, pale and thin, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. She stood under the flickering light, her head tilted slightly like she was listening to something. I could see her mouth moving, but there was no sound. I stared. Frozen. Then she turned toward the camera. Her face was wrong. It looked swollen on one side like she'd been beaten, and her eyes were dark. Too dark. She smiled, slow and deliberate, then the feed went static. I ran outside again, heart pounding. When I reached the alley, it was empty. But something had changed. The light that usually flickered was out completely now. The bulb shattered on the ground. The air smelled like ozone, that burnt metal scent after lightning. I didn't see footprints this time, but I heard something, whispering, soft, breathy, coming from the far end of the alley. I turned my light toward it, but the sound stopped. That night, I didn't sleep after my shift. I just sat in my car in silence before driving home. I tried telling myself it was a prank. Maybe the feed glitched, maybe the last guard set something up before quitting. But I couldn't shake the image of that woman's face. A week later, Marv called me into his office before my shift. "You've been looking rough," he said. "Everything all right?" I told him about the woman on the camera and the footprints. He frowned but didn't laugh like I expected. Instead, he said, "You're not the first to see her." That caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He sighed. There was an incident here a few years back. Before we bought the property, Building F used to be a rehab clinic. One of the patients wandered out one night during a storm. Security didn't notice until morning. They found her in the creek behind the park. Hypothermia. What does that have to do with? She wore a hospital gown, he interrupted quietly. Like the one you saw. I stared at him. You're serious? He nodded. Some guards swear they see her on the cameras, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning. Sometimes they hear her calling for help. Look, I can move your station closer to Building A if you want. Nobody'll think less of you. I didn't want to look like a coward, so I told him I'd stick it out. But that night, I brought extra coffee, 2 flashlights, and a small cross my mother had given me years ago. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I figured it couldn't hurt. The night was unusually cold for late March. Around 1 a.m., the lights outside started to flicker again. I checked the monitors. Every camera was fine except for the one in that alley. Static. I switched to the thermal feed, and that's when I saw it. A faint, human-shaped heat signature moving between buildings E and F. I went to check it out, flashlight in hand. The night air was eerily still. As I walked toward the alley, my radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static followed by a whisper that sounded like my name. Derek, I froze. The radio hissed, then went silent. Who's on Channel 2? I asked. No response. I turned into the alley. The broken light above the dumpster flickered weakly, like it was trying to come back to life. The air smelled damp, earthy, like wet soil. Then I heard it again, a whisper, closer this time. It's cold. My light caught movement near the dumpster. Someone crouched behind it. I took a step forward, heart hammering. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" The figure rose slowly. It was the woman. Her skin looked gray under the light, her hair dripping wet as if she'd just come out of the rain. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that reflected nothing. I took a step back. "I'm just here to help, okay?" She tilted her head again, that same unnatural motion, and whispered, "He didn't lock the door." "What?" She took a step closer. The air around me felt suddenly freezing, my breath clouding in front of me. I stumbled backward, radio trembling in my hand. "Stay back." She kept coming, slow, unblinking. Her gown fluttered in the wind, even though there wasn't any. When I reached the end of the alley, my light went out. Total darkness. I heard her bare feet on the pavement, soft, deliberate. Then a hand, ice cold, brushed my shoulder. I bolted. I don't even remember how I got back to the station. I slammed the door shut and locked it, chest heaving. When I looked at the monitors, the alley was empty again. But on the screen, written across the bottom in faint white letters that shouldn't have been there, were the words, "He didn't lock the door." The next morning, I told Marv I was done. He didn't try to stop me. He just nodded and said quietly, "I understand." Before I left, I asked him one last thing. What did she mean by that? He didn't lock the door? He looked down at his desk for a long moment before answering. When the clinic was still open, the night guard was supposed to keep the patient wing locked. He forgot one night. That's how she got out. I quit that day. I still drive past the business park sometimes on my way to visit my brother. The buildings are still there, but most of them are empty now. At night, when I pass by, one light always seems to flicker. The one between buildings E and F. And every now and then, if I glance into the rearview mirror at just the right time, I swear I see someone standing in that alley, watching me drive away. Story the end. I started working nights as a security guard at the old Maplewood Mall in suburban Ohio in the summer of 2018. It was a dead mall, the kind of place that had been thriving in the 80s, but was slowly dying out with every national retail chain pulling out. Only a handful of small businesses remained, an arcade, a comic shop, a 24-hour diner in the food court, and a pawn shop. Most nights, I didn't see a single person, which was fine with me. I liked quiet. I liked the solitude. But I also liked to know I was alone, which is something I quickly realized I wasn't. My shifts ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and my routine was simple. Monitor the CCTV feeds in the security office, do hourly patrols, and respond to alarms. The mall itself was a labyrinth of empty stores, dark hallways, and shuttered entrances. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, the air conditioning groaned like it was alive, and the echo of your own footsteps in the empty corridors was unnerving if you thought about it too much. I was new, still learning the layout, and on my second week, I noticed something odd. Around 2 a.m., one of the cameras covering the upper-level corridor would occasionally flicker, as if someone had just passed in front of it. I checked the recorded footage, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just static. I chalked it up to an old system. The mall had been poorly maintained, and the security cameras were decades old. But then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a scraping sound in a hallway when I was patrolling the second floor, a faint knocking from inside a closed store. I'd swing my flashlight around and see nothing, but the sound would persist for a few seconds, then vanish. I tried to rationalize it. Probably rats, maybe loose ceiling panels vibrating. One night around 1:45 a.m., I was walking past the old arcade. The place had been shut down for years, but the neon lights above the entrance were still half functional, buzzing faintly. That's when I heard it. A clear, slow shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the cracked tiles inside. I stopped, my flashlight sweeping the room, and froze. At first, I thought it was the night janitor or a worker finishing up, but I quickly remembered no one had access after 10 p.m. I called out, "Hello? Security here." Nothing. Just the shuffle, stopping suddenly, then silence. My gut twisted. I left the arcade and continued my patrol, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The corridors seemed darker than usual, shadows pooling in corners that my flashlight couldn't reach. 2 weeks into my job, I had my first real encounter. It was around 3 a.m., and I was doing my hourly check of the South Wing. Most of the stores there had been empty for years. As I approached the old bookstore, I saw movement near the entrance. A figure, dark, almost blending into the shadows, standing perfectly still. I froze, thinking maybe a homeless person had found a way inside. "Sir, you need to leave," I said, voice firm. No response. I walked closer, flashlight illuminating the space. The figure vanished. I shined the light all around, empty shelves, overturned chairs, dust motes floating in the beam. No one. But then the sound of breathing. Right behind me. I spun, flashlight slicing the dark, but the hallway was empty. My heart was pounding, my palms sweaty. I called it in on the radio, but the only reply was static. From that night on, things escalated. Footsteps, whispers, objects moving on their own. One night I was at the security desk when I saw a door slowly open on camera. Door number 12, leading to an empty storage room. I knew it was locked. Only I had the key. I checked it in person. Door closed, lock intact. I watched the monitor, and 5 minutes later, it opened again. No one was there. The worst happened on a Thursday. I was doing my final patrol before shift change, walking through the second-floor corridor by the old cinema. The floor creaked beneath my boots, my flashlight beam bouncing along the walls. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural humming, like someone chanting softly. I stopped. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once, echoing off the ceiling and walls. I shined the flashlight down the hallway. Empty. Then I heard footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate. Not walking, but pacing. I froze, convinced someone had snuck in. I called out, "Security, I'm armed." Silence. The footsteps continued, getting louder, closer. I turned slowly. Nothing. Then, in the reflection of the glass doors at the end of the corridor, I saw it. A shadowy figure, taller than a man, with limbs that seemed too long, too angular. Its head was tilted slightly, and it didn't move like a human. It glided silently toward the reflection of me. I ran. Heart hammering, breath ragged. The corridors seemed endless, stretching farther than I remembered. When I finally reached the stairs, I turned to see it standing at the top, watching me go. I didn't stop until I was back in the security office, locking the door behind me. I reported the incident to the night manager, who dismissed it as stress or imagination. I knew what I saw, though. That was no person. After that night, I started seeing things more often. Shadows at the edge of my vision, whispers over the radio when no one was there, doors opening and closing on their own. Sometimes when I reviewed camera footage, I'd see a figure standing motionless in the frame, staring at the camera. Then, moments later, the figure would be gone. The final night I worked there was December 1st. It was colder than usual, and the mall's emergency lights were flickering. Around 2 a.m., every camera feed went dark, one by one. The monitors showed only static. I went to check the system room, only to find the door open. I was the only one with the key. Inside, the air was freezing, my breath visible in front of me. The monitors were on, but the screens showed the interior of the security office. I stepped in, confused, and that's when I heard it, a whisper, so close I felt it on my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, empty room. Then I noticed the monitors showing something moving. Not on the screens, but the reflection of the office on the glass. Shadows moving across the floor behind me. I backed away, heart racing. One shadow stopped and pointed. I bolted, ran through the darkened mall, doors slamming behind me. When I reached my car, I looked back. The mall was silent, lights flickering back on as if nothing had happened. I quit the next day. I never went back. Months later, the mall closed permanently. Rumors spread that employees reported seeing figures moving in the empty halls, hearing voices over radios, and even items moving on their own. A few ex-security guards quit abruptly, never explaining why. I still get chills thinking about that place. Even now, years later, when I drive past the abandoned mall, I can't help but feel like something inside is still watching, still waiting. Story the end. I worked as a night security guard in Charlotte, North Carolina, at an old paper mill that had been converted into a storage and office facility. The complex was massive, 3 main warehouse buildings, a couple of office wings, and a long, winding driveway lined with chain-link fencing. During the day, it was mostly quiet, just a handful of employees and delivery drivers. At night, though, it was completely deserted, except for me. My shifts were 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and I usually spent the first hour patrolling the property, checking doors and fences, and making sure all the lights were working. Most nights were boring, and I liked it that way. I could listen to music, drink coffee, and walk around the property without anyone bothering me. The first strange thing happened about 2 weeks into the job. It was around 2 a.m., and I was checking the north side of Warehouse 3. I saw the door to one of the storage units was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it on my previous round. When I approached, the air inside was freezing, even though the summer night was warm. There were footprints in the dust leading from the doorway into the middle of the unit, and they ended abruptly. I radioed it in, but the dispatcher just told me to lock it back up and file an incident report later. I closed the door and fastened the latch. Later, I checked the camera footage, but the door had been closed and locked the entire night. No one had entered or left. After that night, things started happening more often. Doors that were locked would be open the next round. Motion sensors in empty corridors would trigger alarms. I began hearing faint footsteps echoing through the hallways when I was alone in the office. One night around 3 a.m., I was in the security office when the PA system crackled. Through the static came a whisper, "Help me." I froze. My hand hovered over the radio, but I didn't respond. The sound didn't come from the PA, it came from inside the building. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward Warehouse 3. The overhead lights were flickering, and the air was unnaturally cold. I checked every aisle of the warehouse. No one was there. Just shadows stretching across the walls and the faint smell of something metallic, like blood or rust. The next night, I left a small digital recorder running in Warehouse 3 while I did my rounds. When I played it back the next morning, I heard footsteps pacing in a circle for over 20 minutes. Then a voice, low and broken, whisper, "Still working." I later learned that years before, a maintenance worker had died in that warehouse, crushed between a forklift and a stack of pallets during a night shift. Employees had always said his spirit never left, and I was beginning to believe it. The incidents escalated. I saw shadows moving across camera feeds, doors opening and closing on their own, and the smell, that metallic stench, would become overwhelming. Sometimes I'd hear someone breathing just behind me when I was alone. One night I saw a figure in Warehouse 3, standing in the corner. He was barefoot, wearing a torn jumpsuit, and his face was pale and gray. He lifted his head slowly, and I could see one eye reflecting my flashlight. I ran, not stopping until I was back in the security office. The office door had been locked, but the figure had been there. I quit the next week. I couldn't handle it anymore. Months later, I drove past the complex. Warehouse 3 had been condemned and was scheduled for demolition. I imagined that the maintenance worker, whatever remained of him, was still trapped there, waiting for someone to come back. Even now, years later, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and swear I hear the words, "still working." Story, the end.